They told us the Bible would set us free. But in their hands, the Holy Book became a chain. Welcome to Voices from the Colonized, where we tell the stories that history tried to silence the truths buried under colonial propaganda. If you care about reclaiming our history, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so more people hear these voices. And if you want to help us keep producing powerful episodes like this, you can find our financial support links in the description. Every contribution keeps these stories alive. Today, we're diving deep into a brutal truth: how Christianity was used to justify slavery, fuel colonial economies, and control the minds and souls of the enslaved. We'll explore the biblical justifications for slavery, the clash between Christian abolitionists and pro-slavery theologians, and the way conversion became a tool for obedience rather than liberation. This is not just a history of faith, it's a history of manipulation, greed, and control. Biblical justifications for slavery. When European empires began their conquest of Africa, the Americas, and parts of Asia, they needed more than just armies. They needed a moral argument, something that could soothe their own conscience and convince others that enslaving millions was God's will. They found it in the Bible. Colonial preachers pointed to Ephesians chapters 6-5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. This verse was quoted in countless sermons across plantations in the Caribbean, the American South, and Brazil. Missionaries didn't just preach salvation, they preached submission. The so-called curse of Ham from Genesis 9 became one of the most infamous tools of racial theology. Pro-slavery Christians claimed that Africans were descendants of Ham, cursed by God to be servants of servants. This twisted interpretation ignored centuries of scholarship and was crafted purely to justify racial slavery. In 1667, the Virginia Assembly passed a law declaring that baptism did not free enslaved Africans. The law stated, "The conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom." In other words, yes, you can be a Christian, but you will remain a slave. One Anglican missionary in Barbados wrote in 1704, "Their bodies belong to their masters, but their souls belong to God. It is not our place to disturb the natural order the Lord has set." This was the core of colonial theology, separating spiritual salvation from physical freedom. Christian abolitionism versus pro-slavery theology. Not all Christians accepted these twisted interpretations. There was a battle not only on plantations and in parliaments, but inside the church itself. On one side were the abolitionists, Quakers, some Methodists, and individual priests who insisted that slavery was incompatible with the teachings of Christ. Quaker preacher John Woolman wrote in 1754, "There is no fellowship between Christ and the deeds of darkness. To enslave our fellow man is to deny the image of God in him." Figures like William Wilberforce in Britain and Harriet Beecher Stowe in the United States brought Christian moral language into the anti-slavery movement. But they were up against powerful pro-slavery theologians who argued that slavery was part of God's divine plan. In 1835, Reverend Thornton Stringfellow, a Baptist minister in Virginia, published a pamphlet claiming, "The right of holding slaves is clearly established in the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example." Stringfellow pointed to Old Testament laws regulating slavery, the patriarchs who owned servants, and New Testament verses urging slaves to obey. This theological conflict wasn't just academic, it had real economic stakes. By the late 18th century, colonial economies in the Caribbean, the Americas, and parts of Africa depended on slave labor for sugar, cotton, coffee, and tobacco. If slavery fell, entire colonial economies risked collapse. So plantation owners and colonial governments invested heavily in pro-slavery Christian propaganda. Missionaries were often funded by the same merchants and investors who made their fortunes from the slave trade. Slave conversions and control mechanisms. At first, many plantation owners resisted converting enslaved Africans to Christianity. They feared baptism might inspire ideas of freedom or equality. But by the 18th century, they realized something. Christianity could be a tool of control. Missionaries taught a stripped-down version of the gospel, one that focused on obedience, humility, and reward in the afterlife, not justice in the present. A sermon recorded in Jamaica in 1820 read, "You must serve your masters well, for in doing so you serve the Lord. Your reward is not on this earth, but in heaven." Enslaved people were discouraged from reading the full Bible. Instead, they were given slave catechisms, simplified teachings that removed stories of liberation, like the Exodus, and replaced them with parables about faithfulness and patience. Church services on plantations often included readings from Colossians 3:22, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it, not only when their eye is on you." Conversion became a way to make enslaved people internalize obedience, to see submission as godly, rebellion as sinful. But enslaved communities also resisted and reinterpreted Christianity. They found hope in the very stories that missionaries tried to suppress: the Israelites escaping Egypt, Christ breaking the chains of sin, the promise of justice for the oppressed. The rise of slave preachers in the Americas, often secretly ordained or self-taught, turned Christianity into a language of resistance. In Haiti, enslaved Africans fused Catholic saints with African deities, creating voodoo traditions that fueled revolution. In the American South, the invisible church became a place for coded messages and planning escapes. Colonial powers tried to crush these reinterpretations. They passed laws banning gatherings of enslaved people without white supervision, fearing that Christian hymns could hide calls for rebellion. The legacy of Christian slavery. Theology, even after the legal abolition of slavery, the theological scars remained. The same biblical passages once used to justify slavery were later used to defend segregation, apartheid, and racial hierarchies. Churches that had enriched themselves from the slave trade often avoided confronting their role. Some denominations only issued formal apologies in the late 20th or early 21st centuries. In 2006, the Church of England, whose missionaries had once preached obedience to enslaved Africans, admitted, "We are deeply sorry for our involvement in the slave trade and the structures of injustice which grew from it." But words can't erase centuries of spiritual manipulation. The history of Christianity and slavery isn't just about the past. In many former colonies, Christian institutions remain powerful, often aligned with political and economic elites. The memory of how faith was used as a tool of empire still shapes how communities relate to religion today. Conclusion: Christianity in the hands of colonial powers was not just a religion, it was an empire-building weapon. The Bible was used to sanctify chains, to convince the enslaved that their suffering was holy, and to shield oppressors from moral judgment. Yes, there were Christians who fought against slavery, who risked everything to demand freedom. But for centuries, the dominant voice of the church was not liberation, it was submission. And that's why we must remember, a faith that is truly godly cannot enslave. A gospel that is truly of Christ cannot uphold injustice. This is the truth they didn't want us to tell, but we are telling it. If this episode challenged you, share it. Let others hear the voices they tried to silence. Like, share, and subscribe to Voices from the Colonized so these stories keep reaching more people. And if you can, help us keep this work alive. Our financial support links are in the description. Because history will only stay silent if we let it.